To answer the question about what Linux actually is, we need to ask what an operating system is. Academically, an operating system is a kernel. It is a kernel. And the kernel is a piece of software responsible for managing the hardware on a computer. This operating system, or kernel, abstracts away details of individual devices so that we don't need to know every little detail about every little hardware device we have in order to use it. For example, we don't really need to know what the difference is between a hard drive and a flash drive to store a file on it. And the operating system kernel arbitrates access among the different programs. In other words, I can have two different programs running on the same computer. Both of them can access the same hardware. That is technically, from an academic perspective, the meaning of an operating system. Now, in standard usage, when we say operating system, we really mean more than just the kernel. We mean the kernel plus some utilities and programs that come with the kernel. That's actually more precisely called an operating environment as opposed to an operating system. So let's look at the kernel first. The Linux kernel started as a hobby by Linus Torvalds at the University of Helsinki in 1990, and it was openly developed at kernel.org and is today openly developed at kernel.org. It uses Tux, the friendly penguin, as its mascot, and the idea behind Linux was that it was going to be just a hobby. Linus didn't really envision it going anywhere or becoming all that important. Now, Linus's kernel needed some user space tools in order to do anything truly useful with a computer. Almost all software on a computer that's not in the kernel is called the user space, and I have to use some weasel words here because one could argue that the bootloader, which is the thing that gets the kernel running, is maybe not part of the user space, but for our purposes we'll consider it to be part of the user space. And so in a Linux system, when we take our Linux kernel and we put it together with a set of user space applications, we get something called a Linux distribution, or a distro for short. There are quite a few user space applications, and there are quite a few important things that the kernel does. In this diagram, we can see that the Linux kernel is responsible for interfacing with all kinds of different hardware and abstracting away all the details of that hardware so that we can run all kinds of different software. Everything from servers to desktop publishing applications to graphical user interfaces, video processing, and many more. If we look at the software stack as a whole, we can see that the kernel sits here above the hardware, and various libraries and low-level applications sit on top of the kernel and allow us to run higher-level applications, including graphical environments and more complex applications on top of those. So things like 3D rendering, multimedia, video editing, all of these different types of applications rely on various different libraries which can be organized into layers, and all of those libraries interact with the kernel, which in turn interacts with the underlying hardware. So what we have here with a Linux system is more than just a kernel, and it's more than just user space. What we have is an entire distribution of a large amount of software, all of which cooperates to give us a useful system that we can use to power personal computers, tablets, mobile devices, servers, and all kinds of different systems, both large scale and embedded.